Story 1. I was staying for a week at a guest house on some property up in the middle of nowhere in Washington state. I was sitting on the porch early in the morning, drinking a cup of coffee, and I saw a young deer in the yard about 20 yards from me. So I just stayed still and took it in. Then along comes a rabbit hopping in, and they notice each other. The rabbit hops up toward the deer, and the deer cautiously puts its nose toward the rabbit. The rabbit gets up on its hind legs, and they slowly inch their noses closer and closer to each other. Then they touch, and the deer hops straight up in the air. The rabbit runs in a full circle around the deer and then stops. Then they repeated the exact same thing. They did this about 3 times and then ran back into the woods together. This was before cell phones, and I'm glad it was. It was just something for me only, and I am grateful for it. Story 2. Back in 1995, I was sitting on the beach in Durban, South Africa, with a bunch of mates after a night out. The sun was just starting to come up, and a dolphin launched itself out of the water. For less than a second, it was silhouetted in front of the rising sun, and then it was gone. Nobody else saw it, but it is an image that is burned into my mind and will no doubt stay with me for the rest of my life. Story 3. When I was 10, we had a 14-year-old German Shepherd who was getting very sick. I was home alone momentarily as my mom went to the neighbors to pick up a book or something. Our German Shepherd came over, convinced me to walk outside with him, and started licking my hands, looked at me and ran away, jumping the fence, and he never came back. He was so loyal and good that to this day no one believes me and thinks he was stolen because he would never leave. I'm almost certain he did that because he didn't want us to see him die, and he wanted to go to the massive forest area and do his thing. I miss you, buddy. Story 4. I was stalked by a mountain lion when I was young. My family was ahead of me, and I saw it in a tree watching me. I yelled forward to my parents and looked back, and it was gone. I was under 10 at the time and am almost 40 now. I don't even know if it was real anymore. Story 5. At work on the railroad, going down the main line at 40 miles per hour, middle of the day, middle of the woods. Watched a massive thing leap from one tree line to the other, completely cleared a span of about 30 feet without touching the ground. It was on all fours and muscular, bear-shaped but much bigger, and its skin was fleshy pink. I jumped out of my seat when I saw it. My engineer didn't, as he was looking at me while talking. I told him what I saw, described it, expecting to be mocked for it. To my surprise, he told me that 2 weeks before, a different conductor he was working with saw the same thing in the same area. Never heard another thing about it. Story 6. When I was a kid, I would sometimes get up in the middle of the night and go downstairs to get a drink or snack. On the way, I had to pass by this dark hallway that led to my dad's office. I was always scared to look down that hallway at night because I had this fear that I was going to see a small child standing there. I have no idea where the thought came from, outside of my hyperactive imagination. Well, fast forward many years, and my wife, kids, and I are staying in that house during a visit. My daughter is sleeping in my dad's office. As you may have already figured out, one night I'm heading down to get a snack. I look down that hallway as I pass by it, and what do I see? My child standing there. Scared the life out of me. Story 7. 2 foxes ice skating on a frozen pond. My mom and brother saw it too. We watched for a good 10 minutes or more, sometimes on hind legs, sometimes not. But they were definitely playing together and enjoying sliding around. Story 8. I once saw a cat walk up a street to a zebra crossing, stop, look for cars, cross, then walk down in the same direction on the other side of the road. Street smart cat. Story 9. I saw one of the modified stealth helicopters that were used in the Bin Laden raid. I used to live near McCord Air Force Base growing up. During the 1990s, we would occasionally see an F-117 or B-2 flying during the day. But one night in 2009 or 2010, I was hanging out on the shore of a lake doing teenage things and heard something weird. I was along a flight path and near to the aforementioned airbase, so I was used to planes and helicopters flying past. I'm familiar with what Chinooks and MH-60s sound like. But this was different, something was off. That's when I saw 2 helicopters with normal lights break through the tree line. I assumed they were Apaches, but it was dark, and I'm just guessing there. However, between them was a third helicopter with no lights at all, almost like the other two were escorting it. I know it's incredibly rare for any aircraft to be granted permission to fly with no lights. And again, it sounded weird. I could differentiate between the normal thwump-thwump of the two escorts and the mysterious third craft that had a much more muffled thwip-thwip. Anyways, in 2011, SEAL Team 6 crashed one of their modified stealth helicopters during the Bin Laden raid, and they had to acknowledge that the Comanche program wasn't as dead as we were led to believe. Ever since then, I've been convinced that's what I saw that night a few years prior. Story 10. I saw what I can only describe as seeing a star dying. Sometime before 2015, not exactly sure when, my brother had a friend over for a sleepover. Because of this, we were sleeping in the living room that night. We lived out in the country, so the night sky was very clear, and our living room had very large windows facing away from the urban glow. I couldn't sleep, so I was just staring out at the stars. Then, I saw one of the stars I was looking at erupt. It formed a large, thick ring that expanded to several times its original size. Then, it very quickly stopped and then collapsed back in on itself and vanished. Honestly, I know it doesn't make any sense for it to have really been a star exploding and then collapsing, but that's what it looked like. I still have no idea what it really was. Story 11. Babysitting my brother's 1-year-old twins. Both have a couple of words, but nothing close to a sentence. Mom, Dad, cow, a hi sort of thing. One of the kids grabbed my phone off the floor, and I asked for it back. He said, "Would you like your phone back?" Pretty perfectly. I said, "Yes, please," and he handed it to me. No one believes me. Story 12. I was at my parents' house, sitting in the living room. They have a dog, and I was looking at her, waiting for her to give me her attention. After a few minutes, she looked at me. I wanted to teach her something unnecessary, which my parents would wonder about later. I began to raise my eyebrows. She continued to look at me. I did it more often. She was still very curiously looking at me. I continued raising my eyebrows over and over again for at least a few minutes. After staring at me for a really long time, she suddenly raised her eyebrows. I found it so funny and couldn't believe she really copied me. When I told my family, no one believed me, and my parents' dog would not do it again. This was 3 years ago, and from time to time, I sit in front of her, raising my eyebrows. But nothing. Story 13. An entirely white owl. In Brazil's Atlantic forest. Arriving home at 3 a.m., I live just beside a closed forest area. The owl was on the sidewalk. I stopped to photograph it, but it flew away. Probably albino or leucistic. I never saw it again. Story 14. I saw a raccoon ride a deer. I don't think it was consensual. It was kind of like an 8-second bull ride as it sprang out of a dumpster and landed on a doe. Both disappeared into the woods. I still wonder how long that little rascal hung on. Story 15. I came back from dinner with my then-girlfriend, now wife, and our friend to our friend's house. The friend said to be quiet, and we crept up to the window next to the front door. Her chocolate Labrador was lying asleep on the couch that he wasn't allowed on. She jiggled the doorknob for a few seconds before unlocking and opening the door. We went in to find the dog across the room in his dog bed, pretending to be asleep. She went over and woke him up. He looked at all of us like he'd just woken up, sleepily started wagging his tail, got up, and stretched. It was one of the funniest things I've ever seen. Proof that he was smarter than half the humans I've met in my life. If we had that on camera, we would have won the $100,000 on America's Funniest Home Videos for sure. Story 16. I was walking out of work near Seattle Center, and a spotted owl flew right by my head. I have never seen a spotted owl in Seattle or in the metro area. It was pretty amazing cool. Story 17. As a child, I was in the car with my mother driving on the highway as the sun was coming up. I looked at the skyline above the trees and clearly saw a meteor of catastrophic proportions slowly falling from right to left. Orange and on fire with a trail. It disappeared behind the tree line after about 5 seconds. It was obviously some sort of illusion, as it was absolutely massive and would have been devastating. My mom didn't see it. Story 18. Went jogging at 5 a.m., stopped to say a prayer at a statue in front of the church. There was an old lady praying too, so I stopped by her side, closed my eyes, and then I heard the old lady crying. I opened my eyes to check, and she was nowhere to be found. I thought I'd imagined her or something and started jogging again, only to hear something in the back. I turned back and looked, and there she was staring at me. I ran as fast as I could, the most intense jog I'd ever had. Story 19. This happened years ago. My wife and I were moving cross-country in the United States, and we had spent a couple of nights at her grandparents' place in Topeka, Kansas, which is on the far east side of the state. We left after a couple of days of snow. It was a little cloudy, but there was no fog, and we were driving across the width of Kansas to Colorado, where we would be staying with my grandma for a couple of days. Less than 5 miles outside Topeka, we were swallowed by the thickest, densest fog I have ever experienced, including when I regularly drove through fog-heavy Half Moon Bay in California. There was no one on our side of the highway, and no one was coming from the other direction for hours. For the first 3 to 4 hours, maybe one car passed going the other direction. It was just thick fog. We pulled aside once, not even to get gas, just to get snacks and to use the restroom. The gas station was lit up, but there were no cars parked around it, and we could see inside, and there were no people inside. We watched for about 10 to 15 minutes. There were no signs of life. We ended up just leaving because it was so eerie. I cannot express enough how empty it was. When we talk about it, we usually call it Silent Kansas, after the Silent Hill games, because there was just nothing but the thick fog and a sense of foreboding. We drove for hours across Kansas, and the fog did not lift or lessen, and we did not see another living being. There were no signs, which I know are usually there, for gas stations and restaurants. It was just empty nothingness in the fog. And then we crossed the state border into Colorado, and within 2 miles, before even hitting the mountains, the fog was gone. The sky was clear and blue, and there were multiple cars on the highway going both directions. We both experienced it, but we will never be able to prove it happened because it was before the era of ubiquitous smartphones, and neither of us had the ability to record it at the time. It remains one of the most terrifying and inexplicable experiences I have ever had. Story 20. In 2012, I lived in the Midwest near an Air Force base. I delivered newspapers in the early morning hours to make extra money. At 4 o'clock one morning, a drone started shadowing me on my route. It was not a small drone like those today. This was large and high up in the air. I saw it through my sunroof and could hear it humming. It followed me for blocks. I got out of my car to make a porch delivery, looked up at it, and it flew off. Still creeps me out. Story 21. A lady in white on the side of the road around 2 a.m. in rural New Jersey. All white long dress. The other 2 people in the car didn't see her. I turned back to look, saw nothing. Story 22. I was driving down a long stretch of road around 12 to 1 in the morning. On either side, there was just short grass and metal fences. I saw a man in a suit with a suitcase walking the opposite way. Thinking how odd this was, I looked in my rearview mirror, and poof, no man. He vanished with nowhere to hide. I'm 99% sure I saw a ghost. Story 23. I was young, maybe 6. I was being picked up from a friend's house, and the mothers were chatting in the doorway. I looked at my mother, and behind her in the sky, a meteor was coming down. Or something. Maybe space junk. Not just a shooting star, but a main piece that was disintegrating with lots of little pieces coming off it. I kept trying to tell my mother, but she was busy in conversation and gave me the grown-ups are talking, be quiet line. Story 24. When I was a kid, probably 12 years old, I was out cycling without my phone. While I was riding over a bridge in the countryside, I saw something huge down by the riverbed. I stopped, got closer, and I swear to God it was a 2-meter, approximately 7 feet, long leech or a worm or something on the ground, slowly moving towards the river. I rushed home to get my phone to take a photo, but by the time I got back, it was gone. I still have no idea what that was or where it ended up going, but it was there that day 10 years ago. Just for reference, the river itself is only 5 meters wide and in parts narrower. For reference, it's in Croatia, Not a humid tropical country where something like this might realistically happen. Couldn't have been a snake because, for one, we don't have big snakes here, and it didn't slither like a snake. It squished itself and then extended like a worm does. Story 25. In July 1976, I saw an unidentified flying object in the sky. It was like a red dot that zipped across the entire night sky in seconds. It did this a couple of times and then disappeared. Story 26. My cat was meowing strangely in my kitchen at night, and I went over and there was some sort of orange bioluminescent glowing creature that was about the size of a coin. I chased it across the floor of my living room, and at one point it crawled over my hand and clung to my finger briefly. It felt like a mixture of an arachnid and an amphibian somehow. I froze and didn't know what to do, and then it kept going. It got away into some junk in my foyer, and I couldn't find it. A few minutes later, I saw two green glowing dots like laser pointers on the wall, slowly following each other from the living room into the foyer. Then they stopped, and one faded out, and then the other faded out. To this day, I have no idea what happened, but I remember it vividly, and no one believes me. I would be inclined to think I was crazy if my cat hadn't seen the creature first.